Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Vanguard Research Group webinar series of 2022. We are presenting a webinar on a different topic every month. It could be research-related or a critical topic. And we have a schedule out in our newsletters if you want to look that up. Last month, we were talking about Research 101 Session 1, and in particular, Patricia Marta, our Executive Director, introduced some general research concepts such as documentation, Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Vanguard Research Group webinar series of 2022. We are presenting a webinar every month on different topics related to research or clinical topics. Last month in June, Patricia Marta, our Executive Director, presented Research 101 Session 1, where she was talking about the basics of research, such as documentation and different other topics such as institutional review boards and other basics. Today, we'll be building on that a little bit in Research 101 Session 2, where we'll be talking about the study protocol and informed consent. If you didn't get a chance to join last month, you can look back at our recording, which is posted on our website, www.vanguardresearchgroup.com. And I will get back to some of the concepts that were introduced as we need them for this session. But if you want to have more detail and background, you can look back at last month's recording. My name is Marta Hauser. I'm the Director of Outreach, Quality Assurance and Training at the Vanguard Research Group, and we will get started now. Before we jump into our topic today, for those of you who don't know Vanguard Research Group as well, haven't worked with us before, I will just say a few words about our mission. We are a research organization that specializes in community health research. So it's our mission to connect real-world treatment centers with opportunities to participate in research. We are very selective in what trials we take on, so we want to make sure that those are in line with the treatment needs of community health clinics. And we also partner with you and other agencies outside of clinical trials. So, for example, we are assisting clinics with quality improvement projects or provide continuing education, such as this webinar series. Now, today in the training, we will talk about a brief introduction to conducting research, again, in case you weren't there last month, so that you have a little bit of background. And then we will dive into the details of the research study protocol and informed consent. So what is research? Research is an organized, systematic activity designed to answer questions about the development, testing, and evaluation of new treatments. So, for example, we might look at questions such as, does medication A work better than medication B in reducing manic episodes? Or is a new structured therapy program effective in improving the quality of life for individuals diagnosed with a serious mental illness? Or maybe something like, are patients diagnosed with schizophrenia less likely to get hospitalized if they are taking a long-acting injectable or oral medication? So these and other questions are things that you can research, and by doing so, you want to look at those questions in a systematic way, and we'll talk more about that because that's where the protocol for the study comes into play. So as opposed to clinical care, when you do a research study, treatment will be strongly standardized and may include elements that do not benefit the patient directly. Obviously, it will not include any elements that cause harm either, but such things as completing assessments or questionnaires that we can answer those questions might not benefit the patient directly. However, in order to assess new treatment and answer those questions, we need to collect data, right, to be able to answer the question in a standardized way. For that reason, as I mentioned, there's two components that are the very basis of any research study, and that is the study protocol that will tell you exactly what to do, and informed consent that you want to receive from the participants. So we'll start off by talking about the research protocol. Every study has its own research protocol. A protocol is a very detailed description or plan for conducting a research study. It incorporates typical elements, but again, every study will be different and has its own research protocol depending on the details of the study. The protocol study plan has to be submitted to what's called an institutional review board, IRB, or independent ethics committee, IEC, for review and approval before you start a study. So these two committees or review boards were discussed in more detail last month. They're basically institutions that oversee research, so they will look at the protocol and make sure that it's sound and safe for participants, and then give their approval if that's the case. So if you work with us on a study, typically the research protocol will be already written and approved by the IRB or IEC in general for the study. But then we will have to potentially go through another committee that your agency might specifically have and that needs to approve it also. However, again, this was explained in more detail last month if you're interested. If we work together, we will be walking you through everything step by step. So you don't need to worry about that too much at this point, but it's just good to know that there is a committee that oversees research and needs to approve the protocol before you can get started with any research activities. As a next step, the study team working on the study at your agency will need to be highly familiar with the protocol, of course, as you will be working on the study. So the study team consists of different people depending on the study needs. Typically, there is a principal investigator who oversees the study at your agency at the very least, and a research coordinator who does the day-to-day work. Again, more on that in the June webinar if you want to look back. But the important thing to know is that, of course, you need to read the protocol if you're working on a study and be very familiar with all the steps that need to be taken for the study. And typically, there's a protocol signature page where the principal investigator confirms that they have read the protocol and are familiar with it. The typical elements of a protocol, we will go into more detail about each one of them, but just so you have an overview, there's always a background in a protocol, aims and objectives. There's a section on participant selection, on study procedure, safety monitoring, data management, on risk-benefit assessment, and there's a section for references. So for the background, typically what you find in there is reasons for conducting the study. So that will include previous research done that led to the question that you're looking at now, and basically a context of what the current question is and why you're researching this particular question. In the aims and objectives, you will have a specific and detailed research question formulated, usually in terms of a hypothesis. So that might look, we think back to our example questions, that might be something like treatment A will be better than treatment B in reducing manic symptoms, something along those lines. Your next section is participant selection, and that will have details on what group you need to include to answer your research question. So it will have a list of inclusion and exclusion criteria. These are typically things like, let's say you're looking at participants age 18 through 65, male and female. They have to have a specific diagnosis or a specific amount of symptoms on a specific scale. Likewise, in exclusion criteria, you would basically have things that participants cannot show if they want to be in the study. So that might be certain diagnoses that are excluded. There's typically something on substance use or any medical conditions, or anything that you find important to exclude to answer your question in a standardized way. So you want to make sure that you include as broad of a participant base as possible, but you also want to make sure that your data is valid and not based on, for example, a medical condition that a participant has that influences your results. So again, when we work on a study together, you will receive a study protocol. The sponsor has thought about those things and has listed those things, but that's always an interesting discussion to have when you start a study on what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are. In terms of study procedure, you will have a detailed description of any study procedures that will be done within the study. So that includes things like assessments, treatment, of course, but also timelines, an assessment schedule that is typically in a tabular form where you see exactly which assessments are done at what time point. In the section on safety monitoring, you will find information on how participant safety will be monitored within the study. So for example, there are DSMBs, so data safety monitoring boards, that have experts on them that review data to make sure that patients are safe and give their recommendations. So that might be something you can find in this section, or any other methods that are employed by this study to make sure that subjects are safe. In the data management section, you will find a description of how the data is gathered exactly. So you will have, for example, brief descriptions of the assessments that will be done within the study, how data is managed and analyzed. You will have things on information on statistical considerations. So for example, how many patients will be included in a study to have enough information to answer the question that you want to answer. Next, in the risk-benefit assessment, you will have information on expected risks in the study and benefits. So these are things, for example, let's say you have blood work as one part of your study, then an expected risk could be something like bruising from a blood draw or things like that. So these are, of course, important to know and relate to the participant. And lastly, you have a section on references where you will have the scientific articles that were cited within the protocol, mostly, for example, in your background, so that people can look up the sources for the information in the protocol. And sometimes during the duration of the study, there might have to be changes made to the protocol. Those changes are called amendments. And if that is the case, that a change is made to the protocol, then those changes will need to be submitted to the IRB and IEC for review and approval as well, just like the initial protocol. And the modified protocol is then distributed to the agencies that participate. And the study team, of course, needs to familiarize themselves with the changes made. And typically, again, there's a signature page that is signed off for the amendment as well to ensure that everybody has read the changes. The copies of the protocol, so your initial protocol or potentially any amendments, as well as the signature pages, need to be filed in what is called a regulatory binder. That was introduced last month as well. So briefly speaking, a regulatory binder contains all pertinent information to your study. Regulatory binders usually also contain a training log where you can see which trainings are done by which staff members. And again, protocol review would be one thing that would be noted on the training log and filed in your regulatory binder. So the research protocol is basically your Bible for conducting a study. You want to follow it step by step and exactly the way it's written. However, sometimes things don't go as planned, and if things happen that aren't exactly the way that they're supposed to be done, we speak of protocol deviations. Protocol deviations could be major or minor, and we'll talk about that in a second. And some of them, or most of them, might need to be reported to the IRB. Again, the IRB is the institution that oversees all research and has to make sure that patients are safe in the study. So they, of course, want to know if you deviated from the protocol that they approved the way they did. So a major deviation is something that affects participant safety or the integrity of the scientific data, or affects the participant's willingness to participate in the study. So for example, a major deviation would be starting study procedures prior to obtaining informed consent. And we'll be talking about obtaining informed consent in a little bit, but important to know is that that's always the first thing you want to do, right? You want to make sure that the participant is willing to be a part of the study. And if you don't have consent and start, just this quick questionnaire or something because, I don't know, let's say the patient has to wait anyway for the doctor, so it would make sense to just complete this one questionnaire, and then, consent will be obtained. That doesn't work, right? That would be a major deviation. So again, if you're working with us, we're really your main contact for anything study related and are here to help you. So if anything happened that wasn't exactly the plan in the protocol, you would want to let us know, and we will help you figure out what you need to do next. And in case of a major deviation, for example, if we worked with the Northwell IRB, there's different IRBs out there. Northwell IRB would want to know about the deviation within 10 business days of discovery. But again, we'll be working together and we'll be guiding you through the process. A minor deviation is something that does deviate from the study plan as written in the protocol, but does not necessarily affect participant safety or the integrity of data or the willingness to participate in the study. So for example, if you have someone coming in and completing some assessments, but getting exhausted and not completing all the assessments, so you do it later over the phone, that would be a minor deviation and not necessarily something that has to be reported to the IRB right away. You would want to let us know, though, again, so we can guide you on what needs to happen. And typically, when it's a minor deviation, you would have a deviations log anyway that you will keep. And then the minor deviations, in case of the Northwell IRB, for example, get reported with the next annual check-in. That's an annual report that needs to be submitted to the IRB to let them know how the study is going. Okay, so that was the information on study protocols. Of course, it's very basic, and again, if we work together on a study, we'll be talking about protocols and the particular study protocol that we're working on in great detail. But I hope that gave you a good overview of what protocols are all about. And we'll do a little trivia here to see how your understanding of section is. So you don't need to answer, but think for yourself which of these sections are included in the protocol and select all that apply. A, payment to the participants. B, data management and analysis. C, major and minor deviations. D, patient data first. E, research study procedure. And to solve, we have, these sections that are included in the protocol, which are payment to the participants, the data management and analysis, and information on the research study procedure. What is not included in the protocol is major and minor deviations, of course, because we don't know what will happen, right? Deviations are deviations from the protocol as it is written. And PHI, such as patient data first. Okay, with that, we'll move on to the next section, which is informed consent. So what is informed consent? Informed consent is the process by which a person voluntarily confirms his or her willingness to participate in a particular study after having been informed of all aspects of the study that are relevant to the person's decision to participate. So for the informed consent, or to obtain informed consent, studies usually have an informed consent form that includes all the information about the study in accordance with the study protocol that you can use to inform the participant of all major aspects of the study. And this consent form is then signed by the participant as evidence of their decision to participate in the study. So the consent form includes all the main information. So most of the information in boiled down format that you have in the protocol, you will also find the consent form. However, as it says here, it's information that is important to the person's decision to participate. So for example, things like statistical considerations, you will not usually find in the consent form if they're not really crucial to the decision to participate. And just as with the protocol, the informed consent form needs to be reviewed and approved by the IRBA or IEC, including any changes that might be made to the consent form. So if we change the protocol, we might have to change the consent form also, or possibly there's just something that we need to change in the consent form later on. Then we would only submit the consent form. But again, the same applies here. We need to have this reviewed and approved by the IRB or IEC before we can use it. And the template consent form, with all its versions, need to be kept in the regulatory binder as well, just like you will file the study protocols in the regulatory binder too. And it's really important that you use the most recently approved consent form version. So if there are changes and there are new consent forms issued, you have to make sure that you discard the old copies of consent forms, meaning blank templates that you might have printed to use with participants that come in, so that you don't mix them up and you really have only the current consent form as blank templates printed. And just like with the protocol, we have typical aspects of the informed consent form, such as the statement that the study involves research, the purpose of the research, which basically is the background, right? Expected duration of participation, a description of the procedures that will take place, identification of experimental procedures. So for example, if you have a new medication or a medication that you're testing, it will include information on whether or not the medication is FDA approved, any potential risks or discomforts, as we mentioned during the protocol discussions, for example, things like potential bruising from a lab draw, potential benefits to the participant, alternatives to participation, which oftentimes will say something along the lines of the patient being able to either receive treatment as usual at your agency or they can participate in the study. Confidentiality of data, so HIPAA language, information on compensation for participating in the study. Then you also will find contact information to the principal investigator and to the IRB that approved the study in case the patient has any questions or complaints. A statement that participation is voluntary. Section on disclosure of identifiable information. So who will be able to see information, for example, again, within the terms of safety monitoring, if there's anything that needs to be reviewed in particular, or the patient needs to be alerted to something. Consequences of withdrawal from the study, which will typically be a statement that says that there are no consequences if the patient withdraws from the study. They will not continue in the study and will continue to be able to receive treatment at the agency as before. And then the participant, the investigator, and a witness sign the consent form. So in terms of the process for obtaining informed consent, it's important that consent is given freely and is obtained from every participant prior to any research participation and conducting any research procedure, as I've mentioned before. So you will learn this if you haven't taken the Good Clinical Practice or DCP training. You can contact us and we'll direct you we'll give you the directions on how to complete the training. It's a good thing to have. It will tell you a lot of basics about how to conduct research. And a part of that, for example, is information on how to obtain informed consent. It's important to mention that informed consent can only be obtained by staff that's approved to do so. So when you start on the study with us, we will be submitting your agency and all the staff that will be participating in the study to the IRB. And your agency and your staff will be approved by the IRB, just like the protocol, consent form, etc. Again, IRB just oversees every aspect of the study. So when we submit staff, we'll be talking about who will be obtaining informed consent or who will be doing other procedures within the study. And only those team members that were approved by the IRB to obtain consent are allowed to obtain consent. Once you have gone over the consent process and the participant has signed the consent form, as well as the investigator and the witness, you have to file the original consent form in your patient binder and give a copy to the participant. So in the flowchart, you see the process for obtaining consent. It starts with informing the patient of the study and all the details of the study or the review of the consent form. Then the consent form completion, meaning everybody signs off. There's some special considerations, for example, when you work with minors that we'll talk about in a moment. Another aspect to remember is that consent is ongoing, so it doesn't end with the signature that you obtained. It's really something that you will find when you talk to patients throughout the study. They might even ask you, depending on how, what time frame the assessments have. Maybe you haven't done an assessment in 3 months. You might find a patient asking what this was all about and kind of reviewing the consent again. So it's really, an ongoing process. Also, when there's changes to the consent form or to the protocol that you need to discuss, sometimes when there's a new consent form issued, you have to actually formally re-consent and obtain signatures again. So it's an ongoing consent process. But ultimately, you have documentation. So you want to document how informed consent was obtained and that all signatures were gathered. So when consent is properly performed, then the whole process ensures the following: that the participant is fully aware of the risks and benefits, that the participant understands what will be required of them, and what research study involvement will mean. So, for example, how often they will come in, what treatment they will receive, how often they will complete assessments and such. Consent is voluntary, and the participant is not coerced by anyone and knows that what their alternatives are. The participant will be allowed time to review everything in detail and ask questions. It will ensure that all signatures are obtained and that any special considerations are kept in mind, for example, for minors or persons needing representation. So what are those special considerations for minors or for people with a legally authorized representative? Basically, you still follow obviously all the best practice guidelines, but in case of a minor participant, the parents must provide consent for the child's participation. So it's a two-step process in that case. The parent signs the consent form, but the child also signs an assent form, and both are required for enrollment. And then a copy of the consent form must be given to both the parent and the child. Likewise, in case of a legally authorized representative for a participant, the LAR must provide informed consent where necessary, and a copy of the consent form must be given to both the LAR and the participant. So you see an image of an example, the ICF, the informed consent form on the left-hand side. Now this is only the signature page, or example of the signature page. So you see if you were signing as the participant over 18 years old, you would print your name, sign a signature, and date the consent form. You would have a witness, print their name, sign, and date. And then at the very bottom, you would have the investigator, print, sign, and date. Or if you are consenting as a parent or legal guardian, you would have the participant's name, but then you would have the parent or LAR's name and signature and date, and an indication of the relationship to the participant, and again, the witness also. And if it's a minor, you would have an assent form too. You see that on the right, where the participant would print their name and date, and also the witness and the investigator would sign as well. So you want to document the whole process. It's important to remember, again, that you only use the currently approved version of the informed consent form. You make sure that the participant has their name, signature, and date accurately captured, clearly and in the presence of a witness. So that is important just to take a look at, because people sometimes put the wrong date by accident, etc. So it's just important to keep an eye on that, because it's always easier to correct things right then and there. You have the witness name, signature, and date, the investigator name, signature, and date. Everything must be in ink, so you don't want to use pencils or such. If an error is made, for example, the wrong date or something is put in, you want to cross it out neatly, initial and date it, and write an explanation as to why the error was made or a correction. So you do not want to black it out or cross it out scribbly or white it out or anything like that. Again, that would be something that you would learn in the GCP training if you're not familiar with that. And then again, the original consent form and a copy must be given to the original consent form must be filed and a copy must be given to the participant. Sometimes there is a consent log as part of the documentation where you would enter the information for the consent. Often there's also enrollment documentation in terms of an enrollment log, but also an enrollment note. So basically, you want to enter the information that you just obtained as enrollment log, and then document the informed consent process and the enrollment note, and file that in the patient binder as well. So the enrollment note would be a note that has a statement that explains the consent process, how it was obtained, for example, did you read it out to the participant, what questions were asked, how did the patient meet eligibility criteria, the consent date, any potential risks to the participant. Then there's typically a statement that consent was obtained prior to beginning any study procedures, or if there's a medication trial, sometimes there's a list of current medications. So you can see an example of an enrollment note here. On the left-hand side, you would have a little bit of a text where you would explain how consent was obtained, what questions were asked, etc. And then you have typically something like a little checklist for the standard items, such as copy was given to participant, no procedures were done before consent, etc. We can just check those off and then sign and date on the bottom. So this was information on informed consent. Again, we'll do a little trivia here. You can check your knowledge. So informed consent involves all of the following except which one? A, making sure the potential participant comprehends the information being provided. B, giving the potential participant adequate opportunity to ask questions and voluntarily participate. C, the investigator forcing the potential participant to participate in the study. D, obtaining the parent, legal guardian consent and minor assent prior to beginning study procedures. And E, thoroughly explaining the potential risks and benefits of the research study to the potential participant. And hopefully you chose C. Informed consent involves all of the following except the investigator forcing the potential participant to participate in the study. I hope this information was useful to you. Again, our prior webinars are on our website at vanguardresearchgroup.com. You can follow us there. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. We have some information here. Also, feel free to reach out with any questions or comments or interest in participating in research studies with us. You can email me at mhauser, that's MHAUSER @northwell.edu. And our next webinar will be on August 31st, and we'll be talking about clinical high risk for psychosis then. It will be held at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. And you can find more information on our website, vanguardresearchgroup.com, for the August and following webinars. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope to see you in August.